Brazil is one of the biggest countries in the world. Its population is over 3 times bigger than France's. Its economy is slightly bigger than France's, though in nominal GDP terms it's not as powerful, being half the size. The French have many overseas interests and upkeep a large military capable of intervening far away from their homeland. But Brazil borders French biggest overseas territory, French Guiana. So, if Brazil suddenly wanted to take it away from France, could it succeed? Or could the French military keep it safe? Salutations! I have been told there's an imposter out there. A whole army of them, actually. They've been made to look like me. The nerve. And I will not stand. I will not... Man, you are cute. Well, I guess I could use an adjutant. Come here, little fella, I'll take you home. And you too can take your own Binkov adjutant. Available via Amazon UK. Yep, we made a Binkov plushie. If you want one for yourself or as a gift, do check out our Amazon UK store. The link is available below in the video description. It's not too small, not too big, perfect for your desk or your shelf next to your military history books. Or you can give it away. We've made it as low cost as humanly possible, which is very hard when you're contracting very small production runs. Binkov plushie costs 39 British pounds, which amounts to 42 euros or 51 US dollars. Well, go ahead and treat yourself. French Guiana is fully integrated part of France. It's 1/7 the area of entire French mainland, yet its population is tiny as it is mostly covered in rainforests. French forces present are fairly small, numbering 2 infantry regiments and token Navy and Air Force personnel. To the south, the behemoth Brazil looms. If the war started suddenly, the biggest issue for both would be how to get to French Guiana as quickly as possible. Mainland France is quite a bit away, over the ocean, while right next to it, Brazil couldn't get many forces up north either, as most of its military is not positioned near its northern borders. Still, some units are around. One whole army brigade in Macapa is just a few hundred kilometers away, with 2 more roughly 1,000 kilometers by road. Mind you, those roads are mostly simple gravel roads, going right through the rainforests, so travel would take time. Being so large, with fairly poor road and rail infrastructure, except for the coastal regions, Brazil's military would have to rely on rapid reaction forces, meant to be inserted by helicopters or planes. Those feature 1 air assault brigade, 1 paratrooper brigade and roughly 24 various small special force units. Of course, the actual capacity to move all those units at once is lacking. Brazil might hope to move a little over 1,000 very lightly equipped infantrymen by helicopters within a day or 2. Brazil's transport plane fleet might insert more paratroopers, but that's again 1,000 or so men. The planes would mostly be used to ferry equipment near French Guiana, where there are available airstrips, so their units could then continue the invasion by foot. The biggest issue for France would be preventing those Brazilian forces from accumulating in or near French Guiana, and preventing the Brazilian Air Force from controlling the skies. French Guiana has 11 various airstrips. All but 1 are short airstrips not meant for large planes that could do intercontinental flights. Basically, Brazil would need to shut down just 1 runway and thus keep the French from sending in quick reinforcements. Even more crucially, France doesn't have any fighter jets or long-range air defenses stationed in French Guiana. Some shoulder-launched Mistral missiles are likely, but those are for point defenses and can't even reach planes flying at medium altitudes. France does have a contingency plan to send 4 fighter jets with aerial tankers and support crews within just 8 hours from mainland France. But those 8 hours might not be fast enough. Brazil is likely to either bomb the only proper runway into oblivion or have it under attack by an airborne and air assault, thus denying its use to the French. While France could theoretically try to have some very sporadic combat air patrol over French Guiana with a few fighter jets operating all the way from France, those planes would have virtually no time to actually spend over French Guiana. Their effectiveness would be near zero. Brazil would likely amass dozens of their own planes to intercept them. Brazil's combat air force is not that big, and it lacks modern and capable fighters. Their first Gripen unit is not going to be operational for at least another year. The F-5EM is their main fighter. It has a small but fairly modern Italian-made radar and has Israeli medium-range missiles integrated. The AMX planes also have radars capable of providing basic information, so AMX utilizes short-range air-to-air missiles. But it is subsonic and would be hard-pressed to threaten a modern jet fighter. As said though, France simply lacks the means to do much about the initial Brazilian offensive. The first hours would see the small airstrips occupied by small groups of special forces. The largest battle would be for the Cayenne airport, where Brazil might try to organize a large-scale paradrop. Brazil might have more troops than the French there locally, but as those would be very lightly equipped and would be vulnerable during the insertion phase, Brazil would likely suffer heavy casualties. Within the first day though, Brazil would be bringing additional troops by air, and some whole brigades would be making their way into French Guiana by roads. Devoid of airstrips to land their planes on, France might ponder paradropping some of its own troops. The distance is massive, but France does have ample in-air refueling assets. Crucially, its A400M transport planes can be refueled. Each such transport might make a trip from France to Guyana, drop paratroopers or supplies, and come back to France if it gets refueled twice while in air. But what good would such an operation do? Brazil also has AWACS-type planes, in addition to ground-based radars near Guyana. It would be very hard for France to get rid of those initially, and very hard for those A400Ms to somehow get through unnoticed. If France tried such a desperate move, most of its transport planes would be shot down. France has some 10,000 personnel in its airborne units. The A400M fleet, even if availability would be at high 80%, could barely carry 2 airborne regiments, even with very light equipment. So, given that the initial reaction options are limited and inadequate, the best France could do is wait until it amasses enough forces for a counteroffensive. Brazil's overall military is easily larger than the whole French military force. Ground troop numbers, when the Marines are included, favor Brazil by almost 2 times over. The French counteroffensive would start over the seas and in the air, and that's where France is stronger. Its air forces are more modern and more numerous, and geared towards a high-intensity conflict. Brazilian turboprop attack planes would be of little to no use against France over the ocean. Yet one thing works in Brazil's favor: distance. Initially, French would take time to muster up a decent fleet and to sail it anywhere near Brazil, probably 2 to 4 weeks for most of French surface vessels, depending on initial readiness. Submarines could afford to be quicker, and once they are ready, could make the trip in under a week. But the distance is still massive. If it wouldn't use a forward operating base, France would be at a severe disadvantage. Attacking the occupied Guyana would take lots of planes, a permanent naval presence, and lots of ground troops transported over the ocean. France's sole aircraft carrier can offer a limited number of planes, and the ship can't be present all the time. Moving troops and supporting them, as well as supporting ships across the Atlantic Ocean, would be immensely taxing. Luckily for France, it does have forward operating bases. The French islands in the Caribbean would be crucial to the French effort, especially Martinique and Guadeloupe, which have decent port infrastructure and airports with full-length runways. France also has some military presence in their bases in Senegal and Ivory Coast. The naval clash would not come easily though. Brazil knows it can't win a fight out in the open Atlantic without air force protection. Indeed, Brazilian ships are only modestly equipped against aircraft. The Brazilian Navy lags behind French forces in numbers, average size and technology level. France, unlike Brazil, has an aircraft carrier. Brazilian attempts to put Sao Paulo in service have been beset by a decade of failures and low funding. Finally, in 2018, the ship was decommissioned. The Brazilian F-5 jets are not really capable of going against French jets one-on-one. Being smaller, carrying fewer missiles, weaker radar and electronics, it might be that even 3-to-1 engagement ratios might not be enough against the French. France also operates much longer-reach air-to-air missiles, and it's possible France would simply wait out Brazil in the air and slowly nibble away at their overall combat jet numbers. Brazil would have a problem. If it tried to play very defensively and keep its ships near the shores, it would risk losing its own territories. Most of Brazilian islands are very close to the mainland and easy to defend, but it does have some rocks and islands farther away in the Atlantic. Two such island groups would likely get attacked by the French. Trinidad and Martin Vaz archipelago is quite far away from Brazil and would likely not even be defended. It lacks infrastructure and has a very small population. Making a base there would be very challenging, time-consuming, and might not be worth it. But the archipelago of Fernando de Noronha would be the main prize. It has half-decent infrastructure in place supporting its 3,000-strong population, and it already has a small airport which could be expanded. Brazil could try to defend it, but the French would likely have their fleet and planes around the islands, blocking incoming supplies. More Brazilian forces on the island would make it harder for France to take, but also easier for all those forces to starve, thus they might surrender. France would have their carrier nearby, plus a smaller force of planes on station operating from the Caribbean with in-air refueling. Brazil's fighter jets are not equipped to deal with maritime targets efficiently, lacking anti-ship missiles. So Brazil would have to rely on two things to try and break the French Navy: their submarines and their helicopters. Brazil's helicopter inventory is pretty big, and that extends to its navy. They have 12 Lynx choppers with Sea-Skua missiles, 6 Seahawks that can use Penguin missiles, and 8 Cougar helicopters are configured for Exocet missiles. On top of those, their 9 Orion maritime patrol planes use long-ranged harpoons. That force would be the mainstay of Brazil's attack, escorted by the Air Force's F-5s. Still, it would be met with 2 or 3 E-2 aerial radar planes from the French carrier and an E-3 on station operating from afar. It's very unlikely Brazil could manage to sneak up to the French fleet. More likely, most platforms would be tracked 300 or 400 kilometers away and engaged before they could even locate the French ships. Perhaps only the Orion planes, being faster than the helicopters and using long-range missiles, might have some luck, but would be unlikely to survive themselves after firing. Detecting submarines is always part luck, and with the French fleet having a fixed point to attack, any landing force would have to endure a Brazilian submarine ambush. The subs would likely be used up close, launching torpedoes, and then being chased by the French. Brazilian submarines are fairly small and are all conventional, with one French-made Scorpene submarine being modern and with air-independent propulsion. French submarines are all nuclear-fueled and are thus on average more quiet, faster, deadlier, and with much greater endurance. Besides French-owned subs, which would do anti-submarine work, France would likely send as many anti-submarine assets as it can to the area. Their helicopters would operate from their ships, including large Mistral flat tops. The French recently retired their Lynx anti-submarine helicopters, leaving a gap in their capability before the more modern NH-90 fleet is fully procured. The Atlantic planes, while useful around Guyana, would not have enough range to operate near the Fernando Islands. It's likely both sides' navies would play cat and mouse, changing their location often. Brazil could not send ships or planes to the islands, and France could not perform an amphibious landing without losses, as that would mean sending their ships to a well-known and monitored location, and facing potentially a few times more numerous enemy on the shores. Eventually though, France would probably conclude it has weakened the Brazilian navy enough through months of hunting and take the Fernando Islands. It would likely lose several ships in the process, as well as thousands of troops, unless Brazilian forces on the islands surrender, or Brazil decides not to risk its navy and air force for defense of those islands. France would have to keep its Mistral ships far away, as losing just one would gravely impact its further landing potential. Various landing craft would have to be used to their range limits, but operating in the Atlantic would not be easy for such small craft. The overall force France could put on shore by those is fairly small, so it's no surprise that the French Marines number only 2,000 personnel. The French assault of choice would likely come in the form of a paradrop and helicopter assault. Of course, only a small number of choppers shown could be used from ships. Brazil lacks proper air defenses, making France's job a bit easier. It has various AA artillery, but their SAMs are lacking. The islands would likely be bombed into oblivion, but Brazilians would also leave scorched land behind them, taking France months to rebuild the infrastructure. In the end, would those islands even help the French cause that much? Not really. They would provide for a much-needed additional airbase once it's reconstructed and enlarged. They would thus put a lot of southern Brazil in danger of sporadic airstrikes. But when it comes to actually liberating French Guiana, additional aircraft would not do much. France would still be severely lacking in the number of troops it could hope to land anywhere close to Guiana. If 3/4 of the French transport plane fleet are used in one large airdrop attempt, perhaps a little under 3,000 paratroops could be sent in at once, very lightly equipped, joining in perhaps 2,000 more Marines, only somewhat more heavily armed. That force might achieve some initial surprise, as Brazil would likely be devoid of long-range radars and aerial scouting platforms by then. But Brazil force concentration would be immense. Bringing further fresh troops and supplies might take a day for the French. The Brazilian response force would be heavily bombed from the air, but France would be unlikely to concentrate enough planes 24 hours a day to suppress the Brazilians. Furthermore, even the cheap Brazilian turboprops would be an issue, using guided bombs on the landing craft and unloaded supply points. Being light, they could operate from a myriad of runways, making it impossible for France to suppress them all. The rainforest would perhaps be the biggest issue for the French though. Brazil would be sending its light infantry through thick cover, where French air power would be of little use targeting them. The French landing force would be pretty much pinned to a small area. Going away from the shore means going into the rainforest and meeting Brazilians, who would enjoy greater numbers and who are better trained and accustomed to fighting in such a jungle environment. Eventually, the French would be unlikely to raise their landed force by more than several-fold, while Brazil would quickly concentrate its power and haul in some of the heavy weapons that managed to survive the French airstrikes. While Brazilian tanks are old, they would still be a powerful asset against mostly infantry that the French could send in. At best, a dozen French Leclerc tanks might be brought in by landing craft, at the expense of not bringing other valuable troops. But perhaps it's artillery that would be more used by Brazil, rather than tanks, shelling from afar, hoping their numbers would last long enough to suppress the French troops before the French Air Force picked them off one by one. Brazil has a decent artillery force, and it is mobile too, which is important when trying to evade airstrikes. Perhaps their most potent weapons would be their multiple rocket launchers, though they lack precision guidance. Brazil's plentiful mortars would also be used a lot. Being light, they could be used by the jungle infantry from the edge of the rainforests, while still somewhat secure from the French air power. The French would still burn a lot of rainforests in non-discriminating airstrikes though, but they would lack the numbers to burn thousands of acres. Helicopters would see a lot of use on both sides. Brazil would use them to haul in fresh troops near the front line quickly, and their attack helicopters would do what they can, but their low numbers and not so high-tech features wouldn't allow for much. France would likely use attack helicopters from their Mistral ships, but every such helicopter would mean fewer transport helicopters and fewer troops ferried. Additionally, Mistral ships lingering around for long, 100 miles offshore, might increase the chance of a lucky submarine strike or helicopter strike by Brazil. In a matter of days, the French landing forces would be surrounded by literally 10 times more enemy personnel, with the potential for even more troops to keep coming. France would not be able to win on the ground, and French Guiana would not be liberated. The most France could do is go on a punishment campaign. Use its air power and cruise missiles to simply pick out various important and expensive fixed targets. Once the Brazilian F-5s are taken out, French air forces could more or less easily strike from their carrier, the Caribbean and the Fernando Islands. In addition to cruise missiles, standoff rocket-powered guided bombs would come in handy, as there would be no real means for Brazil to intercept the planes carrying them. Still, Brazil is a large country, and at no point would more than a few dozen French planes be operating over its mainland. French strikes would be but small pricks in the grand scheme of things. The ultimate result would be the French losing their Guiana territory forever, but gaining some islands and rocks in the Atlantic, losing several ships, dozens of various helicopters and jets, and perhaps upward of 10,000 troops, if the Guiana assault is attempted, which it would likely not be, as it would be seen as futile even before that. so troop losses would be closer to a few thousand. The Brazilian Navy would be all but obliterated, as it would eventually be hunted down even in ports. The Brazilian Air Force would be at least halved, and whatever remained of it would be forced to hide. And a good chunk of Army's equipment would be lost if the big Guiana landing attempt happens. Would that amount to a victory for either side? Well, Guiana would be part of Brazil, and one could call that a victory. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.